Welcome to the Harvard Business School video series. In this program, Professor Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School introduces industry analysis and discusses how to position a company within its industry and how to create an effective strategic planning process. A leading authority on strategy, Porter is the author of Competitive Strategy, Competitive Advantage, and Competition in Global Industries. For suggestions on how best to use this video cassette and accompanying material, please refer to the viewer's guide and the user's manual in your video package.
I'm Michael Porter, and this is my Harvard Business School classroom where I teach about competitive strategy. Some of you may be very familiar with my ideas on strategy, and others of you may be just learning about the subject. It's a complicated subject. Here at Harvard, I spend about 50 sessions covering strategy with my MBA students. And clearly we're not going to be able in a short program like this to cover everything in this subject. But we've got on our side a very powerful tool, and that's the power of the video medium. Through this medium, I hope I'm going to be able to give you some of the essential concepts of developing strategy, but more importantly, to take you behind the scenes in a series of industries and important American companies to bring the concepts of strategy to life. And in the course of talking to the executives involved and seeing strategy in action, we can learn some lessons about strategy that are hard to learn any other way. What is competitive strategy? Competitive strategy is the positioning of a company in its competitive environment. Now, positioning means more than just product positioning or the marketing concept. It's the total positioning of the company, involving all the functions: production, distribution, logistics, service. The total picture of the enterprise is placing to the competitive environment. Now, how do we go about developing a strategy? Well, in developing a strategy, there are two fundamental questions that we've got to address. The first is the structure or attractiveness of the industry or industries in which we're competing. Some industries are a lot more profitable than others, year in and year out. And we simply must understand why. Because one of the essential parts of developing a strategy is to know how good the game is in which you're trying to compete. The second essential question in strategy is a company's position within its industry. Again, if we look at many industries, we see that no matter whether the industry profits are high or low, companies in the same business have widely different levels of profitability. Some, year in and year out, make a lot more money than others. And any strategist must understand what it takes to be a superior performer in the industry and not be one of the ones that's below average. Both of these questions are vital in developing strategy. Now let's turn to the first question, industry analysis. In any industry, no matter what it produces, whether it's a product or service or of any type, there are 5 basic forces of competition at work that are illustrated on this chart. The force in the middle is the one we most commonly think about, the rivalry among the existing competitors, the jockeying for position, price cuts, new product introductions, new capacity, that sort of thing. In some industries, rivalry is very gentlemanly and genteel. In other industries, rivalry is cutthroat. Somebody's always attacking the other guy. And as we'll see later, this is not an accident. Now, this diagram, however, suggests that industry competition is broader than just the rivalry among the existing competitors. There's the threat of new entry, the threat that new competitors can come into the game. And they bring in new capacity, and if entry is easy, if it's easy for new players to come into the industry, that's going to erode the fundamental attractiveness of the industry. So one crucial dimension of industry structure is the barriers to entry. Industries also compete with substitute products or services. These are other products or services that can do the same thing as the industry's product. So for example, if you're selling steel, you're worried about plastics and other materials because they're substitutes for what your industry produces. If an industry faces close substitutes, this places a cap or a constraint on prices in the industry. You can only raise your prices so much or you'll start to erode the volume as the buyer deserts you to the substitute. You're always buying from suppliers in any industry. You're buying inputs like labor, materials, and machinery. To the extent that suppliers have bargaining power, they can constrain the profitability of an industry because they can, by bidding up their own prices, force the industry to absorb costs that it can't pass on in turn to its own buyers. They can strip the profitability out of an industry. And finally, of course, every industry sells to buyers. And those buyers may or may not have bargaining power. If they have bargaining power and if they're price sensitive, they may bargain away the profitability of the industry by demanding lower prices, by expecting more service that they don't pay for, and so on. So what we see is that in any business, the fundamental long-term profit potential is a function of the strength of these 5 competitive forces. The mix of forces will depend on the industry. Every industry is unique. But the overall strength of the 5 forces is going to determine whether an industry is a profitable one in the long term or one that's mediocre. Now, what determines the strength of each of the competitive forces, whether it be rivalry or buyer power or supplier power or whatever? Each of the competitive forces is shaped by a number of underlying structural determinants. In the case of rivalry, it's things like how fast the industry is growing, how high are the fixed costs, how much can you differentiate yourself from your rivals? These underlying determinants of each force are described in detail in your user's guide. They represent the raw material that you use to conduct industry analysis. To bring these ideas to life, let's take a look at a number of specific industries and see if we can't use this framework to assess their fundamental potential and how it might be changing. The pharmaceutical industry is an $80 billion industry worldwide, and it's one of the most profitable industries of any industry in the economy of any country. The average after-tax return on equity in the pharmaceutical industry has been around 20% for as long as anybody can remember, and very few companies ever have a bad year. Now, why is the pharmaceutical industry such a profitable business? Why is this such a terrific game to be in? Well, to answer that question, let's go back to our 5 competitive forces. Let's start with a buyer. There are 3 different buyers of drugs, but neither the doctor who chooses the drug, the patient who wants to feel better, or the insurance plan that pays most of the cost are price sensitive. Now let's turn from the buyer to the barriers to entry into the industry. How hard is it to get into the pharmaceutical industry? Well, the answer is it's darn hard for 2 important reasons. The first is that in order to get your drug accepted by the doctor, you've got to have thousands of salespeople. They're called detail men in this industry. And they call on the doctor and tell that doctor about new drugs and try to persuade the doctor to try the drug out on his or her patients. And it's very, very expensive to set up one of these organizations, and the doctor is very busy. In addition to a sales force, you need to actually come up with a new drug. You need something innovative to sell to that doctor, and the average cost of developing a new drug today is about $100 million. $100 million just to get into the game. And about $60 million of that is the cost of testing the drug to get it approved by the government, and that takes years. In fact, there's not been a significant new entrant into the pharmaceutical industry since the 1950s, when Syntex entered on the back of their breakthrough in contraceptive pills. Suppliers have little power in this industry. The cost of purchase ingredients used in making a drug is a small percentage of total cost. Most ingredients are commodities where suppliers have little room to raise prices. There are also few substitutes. Once an effective drug is on the market, it takes years for another therapy to make headway against it. Now, how about the process of competitive rivalry in the drug industry? Well, the process is pretty gentlemanly in this industry. Drug companies don't compete on price. They don't compete on price because they don't have to. The buyer isn't price sensitive. they are able to hold up the prices and compete instead on things like their brand reputation, the quality of their sales force, things that don't erode the profitability of the industry. So the pharmaceutical industry is what you might call a five-star industry. Every one of the five competitive forces is favorable. Let's turn to another industry, the airline industry, with a very different level of performance. For much of the post-World War II period, the airline industry has been regulated, both in the United States and in many foreign countries. And this industry illustrates very well how government can fundamentally affect the structure of an industry. Now, how do we think about the role of government in industry competition? It's tempting to view government as the sixth force, to add to the other five. But from our experience, that's not the best way to look at it. The best way to look at it is to see how government is affecting the other five. And by affecting each of the other five forces, government can either be a positive or a negative for industry competition. Now let's look at airlines. Under regulation, government suspended the structure of the airline industry. Prices were fixed, offsetting any power of the customer. Airlines were not allowed to enter new routes, nullifying rivalry. And new airlines were not really allowed into the industry, in effect, making the barriers to entry unbelievably high. Under regulation, the airline industry's profitability was reasonably good. But deregulation unleashed the fundamental structure of the airline industry and has set in motion a set of forces that have led to very mediocre returns since deregulation took place. Now, barriers to entry are very low. All you need is a few planes and you can enter 2 or 3 cities and you've got yourself an airline. And in fact, dozens of airlines have entered the industry as soon as it was allowed by government. The buyer is pretty price sensitive and is not very loyal. How long will you wait for the airline of choice? 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Customers are willing to switch from one airline to another based on who's convenient, who has the best price. Rivalry is intense. You have lots and lots of competitors with different cost structures, with very high fixed cost. Once you've got an airline fueled and you're going to make the trip anyway, you will cut price to get those incremental passengers. And suppliers to the airline industry have some clout too, in aircraft and some other key inputs to the industry. So once government gets out of the airline industry structure, the underlying structure goes to work, and that structure is not very favorable, and the profits reflect that. Now, we've seen how to analyze an industry by looking at the five forces. And we've seen how some industries are fundamentally more attractive than others, and profitability reflects that. But industries are not static. Industry structure can change. It can change either for better or for worse, for two basic reasons. First, environmental forces, like new technology, can shift the structure of the industry. And companies, through their own strategies, also have the power to shape industry structure. How do we analyze industry structural change? Well, once again, we use the five forces. An industry trend or a competitor development is significant for future industry structure if it affects one or more of the five forces. Now, to understand how this works, let's go back to the pharmaceutical industry, that gold mine I talked about earlier. In the pharmaceutical industry, there are three important changes that threaten to undermine that tremendous profitability of the industry. The first has to do with the buyer. Remember that buyer who didn't care about price? Well, that's starting to change. There's increasing pressure on cost control. It's coming from the government. It's coming from the insurance companies. It's coming because the cost of drugs has increased twice as fast as the consumer price index in the 1980s. Now, this increasing pressure for cost control is leading to the second important change in the industry, and that's the emergence of so-called generic drugs. One of these babies. A generic drug doesn't have the brand name of the manufacturer, but has the identical chemical composition. It's therapeutically equivalent. And once a drug goes off of patent, as many have, it's legally possible for the drug to be imitated by another manufacturer. Now, increasingly, the government is legislating that doctors have to prescribe a generic, not the brand name of the manufacturer. The third important change in the pharmaceutical industry is the emergence of biotechnology. Now, biotechnology is a whole new way of doing research on drugs. But let's think about the impact of biotechnology on the structure of the pharmaceutical industry. It's doing a couple of things. First of all, it's reducing the cost of developing new drugs, lowering the barriers to entry. And in the process, whole new companies like Genentech with entirely new skills have an opportunity to enter this industry for the first time in decades. Now, these three changes, cost containment, generic drugs, and biotechnology, are all undermining the structure of the pharmaceutical industry. And unless drug companies can react or respond, the average profitability of that industry is likely to go down. But it doesn't always work that way. In some industries, structural change is positive. Now, let's return to the airline industry and discuss three important changes that are occurring in that industry that have the promise to fundamentally improve the industry that's been so difficult and so competitive for the last decade. The first important change is the so-called hub and spoke route system. Now, by having a lot of flights coming in and out of the same city every day, in a very coordinated way, an airline could get major efficiencies in operations, in marketing, and a number of other aspects of the business. The effect of the hub and spoke system was that airlines have started to compete on the basis of hubs, not on every individual flight. And this has also raised the barriers to entry into the airline industry. To get into a city now, you have to offer enough flights to compete with that airline who has that city as a hub. Another force changing the airline industry is the emergence of sophisticated management information systems. An airline is involved in hundreds of millions of transactions every day, fares, schedules, tickets, and modern computer technology has revolutionized the way all this can be done. It's allowed it to be automated. The problem, though, is that it takes millions, and if not hundreds of millions of dollars for an airline to develop this kind of sophisticated technology. And this huge investment has substantially raised the barriers to entry into this industry and given a new lever for some airlines to outdo others. The final change in the airline industry that's going to improve the industry structure is the so-called frequent traveler programs, where airlines give free travel to passengers who accumulate miles on their airline. Now, what are the airlines trying to do with frequent traveler programs? You'll remember that one of the crucial problems in the industry is that it was hard to differentiate. One airline was perceived as the same as another. Well, the frequent traveler programs have started to change that equation, and in the process, again, rivalry is starting to get less intense, and the barriers to entry are going up. Now, we've seen a number of industry examples spanning very different types of industries. What should we have learned about industry analysis? Well, first of all, we should have learned that industry analysis is the starting point of any strategy. You simply must understand the structure of each and every industry in which you're competing and the underlying reasons why that structure is what it is. Each industry is going to be different in terms of which competitive force is the most significant. And sometimes it's the buyer, sometimes it's barriers to entry, sometimes it's rivalry. But whichever force is most significant, that's the place where strategic attention really needs to be placed. That's where you should focus your creative energies in trying to improve your environment. Another crucial lesson in industry analysis is that you must constantly be looking for how your industry might change. Because we've seen in airlines and pharmaceuticals how important and even revolutionary industry structural change might be. And we've seen how to use the 5 forces framework to analyze how your industry might indeed be changing. We've also seen, however, that companies have the power to shape their industry. You're not a passive participant in your industry. You can influence how industry structure evolves. And an essential part of any company's strategy must be an approach to making the industry structure better, particularly if a company is a leading company. But the final lesson is that there's a flip side of all this, And that is that companies can unwittingly destroy their industry just as easily as they can make it better. Many companies, by not thinking through the implications of their strategic moves, will go down a strategic path that undermines the industry structure, that makes the five forces worse. Any strategic move of any sort must constantly be tested against its impact on the fundamental structure. We've looked at how to analyze an industry, the first essential question in strategy. Now let's turn to the second question. How does a company achieve superior performance within its industry, whatever the average industry profitability may be? Now, the starting point for understanding why a company is a superior performer is pretty simple. That is that to be a superior performer in your industry, you've got to have a sustainable competitive advantage. A company has to have something it can do better than its rivals that it can protect from imitation. It can keep its competitors from replicating. Now, advantage can be sustained in one of two ways. Either you can be lucky enough to come up with something that your competitors can't ever copy, which is rare, or more commonly, you can improve faster than your competitors can catch up. And continuous improvement and continuous search for new benefits and edges is really part and parcel to most successful companies' ability to sustain advantage. Now, if competitive advantage is the key to superior performance, how do we get one? Well, to understand that question, we must recognize that there are two basic types of competitive advantage that any company can possess. One is low cost. The company can be lower cost in designing and producing and delivering and marketing its products than its competitors. It has lower cost and therefore it can earn superior margins and therefore superior performance. Now, the other kind of competitive advantage is what I like to call differentiation. A company that's differentiated is able to provide some kind of unique benefit that its customer thinks is important. And because it's unique in an important area, its customer is willing to pay it a premium price. And that premium price leads to superior margins and, in turn, superior performance. Now, if we think about it, almost any strength or any weakness that a company has can be translated either into something that makes their relative cost position high or low, or something that affects their ability to be differentiated relative to their competitors. And as we'll see later, it's very important to understand which one a company is trying to achieve. Now, in seeking one of these two types of competitive advantage, any company has another fundamental choice to make in setting its strategy, and that's what I like to call competitive scope, the breadth of the target within which it's seeking to gain that advantage. Now, some companies, like General Motors historically in the automobile industry, have picked a broad competitive scope. They've offered a wide range of products to a wide range of customers in a wide range of geographic markets. Other companies recognize that they can't achieve competitive advantage with a broad range of consumers or in a broad range of product lines. And therefore, they pick what I would call a narrow scope. Focusing on a particular product line, a particular type of customer, a particular type of geographic area, perhaps. And they seek to gain advantage in this narrow arena, even though they can't achieve it overall. Now, these two essential variables, the type of advantage and the scope of advantage, lead to what I like to call generic strategies, some fundamentally different routes to competitive advantage that companies can choose. Now, as you see in this chart, there are four basic options. A company can seek a broad positioning and to be the low-cost producer. Or it can seek a broad positioning and try to differentiate itself with that wide range of customers and segments, and so on. Or it can choose a focus strategy by narrowing its target to some unusual segment and seeking to be either low-cost or differentiated in that particular area, even though it can't achieve those advantages overall. What we learn from studying a wide range of industries is that the worst strategic error is to be stuck in the middle, to not be willing to choose which of these routes to competitive advantage the company is going to follow. To worry about quality and differentiation, but not achieve uniqueness in anything, and to think about segmentation of the market, but to not be willing to dedicate themselves to a particular narrow segment. These kind of companies are stuck in the middle, and they're going to be the below average performers in any industry. Any company seeking to gain a cost advantage must start with a good product. A low-cost strategy starts with a good product. It starts with a product that's acceptable in quality, that's acceptable in features, that meets the basic needs of the consumer. But the low-cost competitor doesn't offer all the frills and all the bells and all the whistles that they potentially could. They seek simply to produce a good basic product. Instead of frills, their advantage is going to come from opening up a significant and a sustainable cost gap over all their competitors. And they do this by managing the critical drivers of cost in their business, whatever they may be. Now, in gaining this low-cost position, the cost leader translates this into superior margins, provided they can command prices that are at or near the industry average. In strategy, there's a very important equation which determines fundamentally a company's ability to be a superior performer. And that equation is the comparison of a company's prices relative to its competitors and its cost position relative to competitors. Any company that's a superior performer either has higher prices or lower costs, but there's a balance to be struck. In a cost leadership strategy, a company is trying to be the low-cost producer and get a cost advantage. That's where its advantage is going to come from. But it must not let its prices get too low, or its cost advantage will be nullified or offset by lower prices. Now, let's look at two companies that have successfully implemented cost-based strategies. Every one of us uses bar soap, hopefully every day. That's why it's a $1.6 billion industry in the United States. When one thinks of soap, one thinks of one company, Procter & Gamble. When one thinks of Procter & Gamble, one thinks of one soap, Ivory. One might think soap is a mundane business where there's little opportunity for strategy. After all, soap is soap. In fact, soap provides a fascinating example of competitive positioning. Ivory was introduced many years ago, actually in 1879. At the time, there were over 300 companies in the soap industry. Most of these companies competed with a strategy producing very crude soaps. The other competitors in the soap industry at the time were producers of very expensive luxury soaps. Now, Ivory decided to enter the market with a very different strategy for the time. The basic Ivory strategy was to introduce a pure, mild bar of soap without the harsh ingredients and alkalis that were characteristic of the other soaps of the time. The Ivory bar also floated. Interestingly enough, though, the floating was an accident. Ivory made some bars up by accident in the manufacturing process, and it turned out that they floated. Consumers were so interested in that feature that Procter & Gamble quickly decided that it was a good idea. In addition to the product itself, however, Ivory created some very important symbols of its strategy. The first was whiteness. At the time, most soaps were brown in color, various shades of brown. Ivory instead became the white soap. Ivory was the first heavily advertised soap. In fact, one of the first heavily advertised brands in the United States of any kind. In addition to the advertising, though, was the advertising message. Harley Procter had a very interesting idea. He had the problem of communicating purity, and there was no well-established standards for purity in the consumer's mind. So Harley Procter designed his own measure of purity, which led to the famous slogan, 99 and 44 100% pure. This became the slogan that personified the Ivory brand. Once Harley Procter had created this measure of purity, he aggressively used comparison ads with other soaps. In fact, tables appeared in magazines which compared Ivory to other brands. Later on, he started very early to use endorsements. He had chemists and physicians certified to the purity of the Ivory brand. The final early innovation in Procter & Gamble advertising was the use of the image of the baby. The baby became one of the early symbols of Ivory. Mild, if it's mild enough for the baby, it's got to be mild enough for you. The results of the Ivory strategy were astounding. Ivory became the differentiated soap in the United States. It commanded a premium price, and it also commanded a leading share of the soap market, dominating all other competitors. Ivory pursued its differentiation strategy up through the 1940s and 1950s. But important changes in the industry in the 1950s and 1960s were threatening and challenging the traditional Ivory strategy. The first was Dial. Dial was the first of the so-called deodorant bars. In addition to basic cleaning, it offered a deodorizing feature as well. A number of other deodorant bars followed. The second major development was Dove. Dove was specially formulated to take good care of the skin, so-called beauty bar. Dove was introduced in 1956, and again, others followed. Now, the introduction of Dial and Dove fundamentally threatened the positioning of Ivory as the differentiated soap. These new products had features that Ivory didn't have. Now, Procter & Gamble had a choice at this stage. It could have added these new features, one or both of them, to Ivory, but it chose not to. Instead, Procter & Gamble decided to strategically reposition Ivory. Now, the basic Ivory bar remained the same. It's white, it floats, it's 99.44% pure, but Ivory moved from being the differentiated soap to being the good basic soap that represents a good value. It moved from being the differentiator to being the cost leader in the soap industry. And in the process, Ivory was able to maintain its leading market position. Now, what is the new Ivory strategy? Well, let's start with the bar. The Ivory strategy is to have a simple, basic, no-frills soap. No unnecessary ingredients, no scents, no perfumes. Now, how about the packaging? Well, as you can see here, the Ivory package aims for simplicity. There's no expensive papers, no shiny paper, no garish colors. Look at this bar here. That's pretty garish. Ivory goes for simplicity, for simple, for basic. Now, in terms of packaging, Ivory pioneered a practice in the industry called bundling. Here's an example of a bundle of soap. There are 6 bars here sold together. And what this did was go from having a bunch of bars sitting in the bin in a disarray to a neat kind of package. And the idea here was that Ivory could be used by the whole family, so you should buy it in quantity.
The user for Ivory is a remarkably diverse consumer base. There is no meaningful demographic skew on Ivory, as you might expect with a brand of that kind of market share and broad usage. It is well developed amongst females, adult males, children and infants, for many, many purposes, ranging from face to hands, bath, shower. And that is really one of the things that makes Ivory unique. When we sit down with consumers, we'll give them an array of 30 or 40 available brands and ask them to cluster them as they see the brands clustering. Ivory always sits out by itself. And that's one of the things that distinguishes it, is it's really all-purpose versatility.
Ivory's pricing changed to reflect its fundamental shift in strategy. Instead of pricing at a premium, Ivory set its prices lower than its major differentiated competitors. The final aspect of Ivory's strategy was advertising, and Ivory advertising again stressed this theme of simplicity, a basic soap for the whole family, nothing more, nothing less.
I know I'm new, but this price can't be right.
What's wrong?
Ivory costs less than just about all the other soaps in the store.
It usually does.
I can't believe a great soap like Ivory costs less. I mean, that rich lather and natural kind of clean.
In fact, 4 bars of Ivory usually cost less than 3 of most others.
I thought they'd charge more for a great soap like Ivory.
They probably should.
You'd expect to pay more for Ivory, but isn't it nice you don't have to?
We've seen the new Ivory strategy. Now, what makes Ivory low cost? Well, let's look at a number of the most important elements. Let's start with the air bubbles. The air bubbles in the Ivory product inherently reduce the amount of material required to manufacture an Ivory bar. The lack of expensive additives like deodorants or beauty features also make the bar inherently less expensive. The simple packaging with no shiny materials or expensive papers are inherently cheaper to produce. And Ivory, because of its long, consistent brand image, controls advertising cost. Now, the brand image, in addition to the fact that Ivory is such a good value because of its lower price, means that Ivory is a very effective traffic builder for the retail store. And that means that Ivory has to spend less on trade promotion than many of its competitors do. When you add to this that Procter & Gamble gets other cost advantages through scale and things like purchasing and distribution, all this means that Ivory has a substantial cost advantage over many of its competitors. Ivory charges a lower price, but its cost, because of this strategy, is even lower. And the result is a very profitable business. The intriguing thing about the Ivory strategy is it makes many of these cost savings into a virtue. Now, if we step back from the soap competition that I've described, I think we can get some insight into how various strategies play against each other in the industry. Now, we can see from the diagram that Ivory competes with just about everybody. It competes with Dial and Dove for the more quality-sensitive consumers. It competes with the no-name brands for the very price-sensitive consumer. It doesn't compete, however, very much with the exotic brands because they're really targeting a totally different part of the market. But despite Ivory's success, the soap business isn't standing still. It's always changing. The latest interesting development in the industry is this product here. It's a new soap called Pure and Natural. Does that remind you a little bit of Ivory? In most companies, old brands sort of get left alone to kind of fade away. But that hasn't happened at Ivory. Why not? Why the continual improvement?
Well, Ivory really became a gigantic brand to us very quickly. It was really part of Americana before the end of the 19th century. It was the leading brand, and it wasn't very difficult in those circumstances to realize the importance of keeping it up to date in terms of what consumers wanted. And also to recognize the very particular characteristics it had of purity and mildness, floated, was white. So the fact that it was of such gigantic importance to the company, there were many people in those days that called Procter & Gamble the Ivory Company.
So the whole idea of maturity is sort of a misnomer, isn't it?
Totally misnomer. The idea that there is some product life cycle, which you'll sometimes hear talked about, that you're destined somehow to go up and then start to come down, is totally an issue that's in the control of the people managing the business.
You mentioned earlier that it's the sort of key first step is really being in touch with the consumer and what that consumer really wants at a very personal level. You know, how do you and the other Procter & Gamble executives actually do that? How do you understand the consumer? You just can't kind of think about it. You've got to get more input than that. How do you do it?
You've got to sit down and talk to consumers. And there are a whole variety, and you need to do it in a whole variety of ways. You can get benefit from talking to a group of consumers at one place. And I do that every time we've introduced a major new brand. Since I've been president of this company, and I certainly did it before, I will find an opportunity to get out into the test market. And I want to look at stores, but I also want to sit down in a room with consumers and hear them talk about the brand.
We've talked a lot about the change at Ivory, but you've already hinted at the continuity. Despite over 100 years of history, here's a brand where certain essential elements have been preserved. How do you actually preserve continuity as people change, as time changes? What process do you use to do that?
Well, there's several, as you'd expect. One is simply the continuity of our own management. We promote from within without really any exception. We know each other awfully well. The people who've been responsible for Ivory over the last 30, 35 years are all still in this company. Now, they're not all working on Ivory every day or every week or even every year, but they are here. The point of continuity, too, I would also stress is importantly related to our advertising agencies and our attitude toward our advertising agencies. Our relationships with agencies are ones that are very long-lasting for us. And again, Ivory's a marvelous example of that. We have been working with the same agency on Ivory for 67 years.
John, what does a brand mean at Procter & Gamble?
Well, we think of a brand as, it's almost alive. It may sound corny to say that, but it becomes almost a person. It's first and foremost something that we just see bring benefits to consumers, and that's the way we really view what we're about, is bringing benefits to the consumers. But it assumes a personality, almost a character to it.
Now, as we look over the history of the bar soap category and the history of Ivory, we see a succession of new segments opening up and new competitors coming on the scene, Dial, Dove, other products. Now, by and large, Procter & Gamble, in dealing with those changes, has chosen not to kind of change Ivory, but rather to introduce new brands. Why is that? Why not just create a new model of Ivory? Why introduce a whole new brand?
These have been very difficult, challenging decisions. Each one of those you mentioned. Should we make Ivory a deodorant bar? Should we add cold cream or some other cosmetic ingredient to Ivory? Mm-hmm. Believe me, as I answer this, don't let me leave you with the impression that the answer was obvious or we didn't go back and forth in the thinking process on it. We did, and on each and every one of them. But in each one of them, too, we felt that the right way to proceed was to introduce a different brand to provide that benefit, because we felt that adding deodorants to Ivory or adding a cold cream ingredient to Ivory would really be inconsistent with one of the basic features, qualities, attributes that consumers wanted. And because we felt that the values that Ivory did stand for, as it was, were still of such broad appeal and broad interest to consumers that we would be able to have a healthy, and if we operated it properly, a growing business without having those ingredients. So we felt we ought to leave Ivory in that sense the way it was, that is, not containing these ingredients and not providing those particular benefits, and do them on another brand.
Now, we've seen and heard the Ivory story, a classic story in American industry. What lessons does the Ivory story hold for strategy? Well, I think it holds lessons at two different levels. For strategy in general, as well as how to compete with a low-cost strategy. The soap industry illustrates how a number of companies can successfully compete in the same industry, provided they choose different strategies. Ivory has been successful, Dial has been successful, Dove has been successful. They're all choosing different positions in the marketplace. But Me Too strategies rarely succeed. We've never heard of most of the other soap brands that tried to imitate either Ivory or Dial and Dove. They never made it. The Ivory case also shows us that the successful strategies are ones that are consistently implemented over long periods of time. You can't succeed in strategy if you're flip-flopping what you're trying to be every year. The flip-flopping not only confuses your organization, but it confuses the marketplace. The marketplace doesn't really know what to make of your product or service. Now, the Ivory story, however, vividly illustrates the principle that strategy has to change if the industry structure or competitive positions change enough. The emergence of new buyer needs, the threat of new competitors may force a company, as it did Ivory, to shift its strategy. In Ivory's case, from differentiation to low cost. But shifting a strategy is a very risky and very time-consuming process. And Ivory shows how long it took really to fundamentally reposition the company. Now, we've seen a company that's drawn its cost advantage from a broadly targeted strategy. Let's look at another company that succeeded in creating a cost advantage through focus. Boy, I sure am glad I didn't have to drive here from Boston. It had taken me about 40 hours because I'm in San Antonio, Texas, and I've just driven up to a place called La Quinta. That means country house in Spanish. La Quinta is one of the most successful motel chains in the United States. Founded in 1968, today it has about 200 locations spread all over the southwestern part of the United States and outlying areas. La Quinta's results during the 70s and into the 80s were truly spectacular, second to none. In recent years, however, La Quinta's profits have been modest. It's been hit by the Texas energy recession, by problems in the agricultural sector, and by a dramatic overbuilding of motel rooms in this region. But short-term profitability is not a good measure of the strategic health of a company, and La Quinta provides an excellent example. From a strategic point of view, La Quinta could not be in a stronger position. Their customers are satisfied, their competitors can't match them, and Consumer Reports recently evaluated them as the leading lodging chain in their category. Now, to understand La Quinta's strategy, I think the best place to start is just to go take a look. Now, what's going on here? What's going on is that most lodging companies cater to a wide range of travelers with a wide range of needs. They have families, they have high rollers, they have chief executives, they have people traveling for personal reasons, and they provide those travelers a wide range of services to meet their equally wide range of needs. Daycare for the family, a fancy suite for the high roller, a room service for the tired executive who doesn't know where else to go to dinner and doesn't want to go out alone. Instead of trying to serve a wide range of travelers and meet their equally wide range of needs, La Quinta has chosen to focus on a particular kind of traveler, a particular target customer, and dedicate themselves to meeting this particular customer's somewhat unusual needs. A classic focus strategy. Now, La Quinta's target customer is a commercial man or commercial person. A sales representative, a service representative, an auditor, somebody who travels frequently, who travels repetitively, over and over again to the same places. The average La Quinta customer spends 17 nights a year in a La Quinta. La Quinta seeks to meet the needs of this somewhat peculiar customer very, very well and no more. And as we'll see, everything in a La Quinta and throughout the La Quinta organization is consistent with this objective. La Quinta's strategy starts with location, location, location. As Sam Barshop, La Quinta's founder, told me recently, you can change just about anything about a motor inn except where it is. Every La Quinta is located right next to a major highway, often an interstate highway. It has good access and excellent visibility. The La Quinta is near an industrial park, an airport, a medical complex, somewhere where business people go a lot. Now, over here you'll see a restaurant right across the way from the La Quinta. The restaurant is open 24 hours a day. In fact, every single La Quinta is built next door to a 24-hour restaurant. Many of them are Denny's. Now, the fact that there's a restaurant right there means that La Quinta doesn't need a restaurant of its own at all. If its guest wants to go to breakfast, he just walks across the street. La Quinta wants no part of the restaurant business for a number of reasons. The first is that Sam Barshop lost his shirt in the restaurant business when he was growing up. More importantly, though, the restaurant business is a different business than running a motel, and it's a business that most lodging establishments lose money on and have to subsidize with higher room rates. Now, my room here is about 300 square feet in size. That's as big or even bigger than a Marriott or a Hilton or a Sheraton room would be. And to top it off, La Quinta's rooms are all built with an all-concrete construction technique. And this construction technique, combined with a lot of soundproofing between the various rooms, means that it's quiet. It's beautifully quiet. And you can actually get a good night's sleep. Now, when you combine all this with 24-hour message service and a heavy dose of good down-home personal attention, what you get for a La Quinta's customer is truly an irresistible deal. And it's an irresistible deal that cost only $40, substantially less than a comparable room would cost at a competitor.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Bailey. Will you be checking out this morning?
Yes, I will be. Thank
Room
you.
107?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Excuse me, can I ask you a few questions?
Sure.
What do you do?
I'm a salesman. I travel the state of Texas, selling newspaper vending machines of all things.
Oh, really? How have you been here before?
Oh, yes, yeah. I stay here every time I'm in San Antonio.
And how often is that?
Well, I get through here about every 4 weeks.
About every 4 weeks. Why do you stay here?
Well, I think probably the main reason I stay at La Quinta is consistency. Every motel is like the other one, and all the rooms are comfortable. I know what I'm going to get in advance.
Now, they don't have room service here. Does that bother you?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Why not?
Well, I don't really require that. Traveling, I'm out to lunch with people during the day. Sometimes I have evening appointments that I make, and I'm busy. So throughout the day, I keep myself moving, and to be catered to in a motel, I don't require that. I just want a good place to sleep and rest and do my reports, get on the next day.
And La Quinta is that place?
Oh, absolutely.
Now, the question is, how is La Quinta able to deliver all this at such a low cost? Now, the first reason should already be apparent from what we've seen so far. La Quinta avoids unnecessary services from the perspective of their target customer. They also avoid wasted space. There's no restaurants, there's no room service, there's no atrium. This means that the operating cost per room at La Quinta is held down. It also means that the amount of investment required per room at La Quinta is also low. Despite the fact, therefore, that the room itself is as big or bigger than the competition, La Quinta's costs are lower. Now, another reason why La Quinta's costs are controlled is that there's a corporate fetish here for cost control. Corporate overhead is held down, construction costs are managed carefully, purchasing costs are managed carefully. The corporate headquarters itself is sort of an interesting symbol of this. It's nice, but it's modest. There's no oak paneling, there's no frills that eat money. Now, in addition to these things, however, perhaps the secret weapon in La Quinta's strategy is a couple of all things. Unlike most other lodging chains, a La Quinta is managed by a husband and wife team. They run the desk, they supervise virtually every aspect of what goes on here. And they actually live here. They live in an apartment, a nice apartment, provided on the premises along with some other perks. Now, the fact that La Quinta is managed by a couple holds down overall management costs. The couples are also very loyal to the company. They stay at La Quinta 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, reducing expensive turnover. And a final bonus, and perhaps the most important bonus of all, is that the couple and the other employees that they manage almost like a family at La Quinta provide warm, friendly service and a great deal of personal attention.
So you can better understand.
La Quinta couples receive extensive training before they ever take over a motor inn. About 12 and a half weeks of training in all. Right now I'm in something they call the maintenance training lab, and spread around this room are all the things that go wrong in a motor inn. Roofs, air conditioners, TV sets, faucets, plumbing, lamps. And in this room, the La Quinta couple learns how to make basic, simple repairs on the spot. Now, this does a number of things. First of all, it makes the repairs happen quickly. You don't have to wait for somebody to show up. But very importantly, it reduces cost. And it's this kind of clever thinking, along with the design of the rooms, along with the sturdy construction, along with a lack of unnecessary services, that makes La Quinta such a low-cost provider of motel services. Let's take, for example, having a bar at La Quinta. You know, at the end of a long day, a salesman comes back and wants to have a drink. Why isn't there a bar at La Quinta? You'd think that
there's not a bar because it's extra services. My theory has been, and it's stronger every day, is that the more services you give a customer, the more chances you have to make a mistake. If they want a drink, they'll take a bottle to the room, or they'll go to a restaurant near the property and have a drink. But we have found that is not way down the list as far as priorities as far as our customer goes.
But I guess it's fair to say that when you build a strategy around this customer, you're deliberately making a choice that there's some other customers with some other needs that might not be satisfied, and you're just making the choice.
I think in our industry, and I think in all industry, you really have to target in on your customer, understand your customer, and listen to your customer, and work with your customer, and pay attention to their needs. And their needs change. They change yearly. Mm-hmm. We put in colored television, then we had to put in cable, then we had to give free coffee, the free telephones. There are things that they demand, and we constantly survey our customers and see what they want, because they're the boss. I'm not the boss of this company. It's every customer that walks through that door.
Let's just pick a company like Marriott. Marriott has got its core product, its large properties that are located all around the country, but it's got this Marriott Courtyard concept. Now, what's Marriott trying to do? Are they trying to kind of come after the La Quinta segment? Is that what's going on?
Marriott is trying to be the General Motors of the industry, and they're going to be. The difference between Marriott and La Quinta is Marriott thinks big, La Quinta thinks small.
How about, how would you compare La Quinta to, say, Motel 6, a classic
Motel
kind of low
6,
price?
Motel 6 knows what they are, and they're another good company. They know what they are. They're selling room for about $20 a day. They are not competing for our customers. They're taking people off the backs of motorcycles and campers and put them into a motel room.
La Quinta has always had a very great sensitivity to cost. Partly to keep the price of that room down, because that's essential to the strategy. How do you keep the attention to cost in the company?
I talk about nickels and dimes, and we're not working on dollars in this company. We're working on nickels and dimes. We're working on minutes in cleaning the room. And we're working on every dollar we can save in building a building we can make, because our buildings are so cost effective now. We know every nail, we know every brick that goes in that building. We know what the land cost should be. We understand the product, and that's a big advantage of having only one product. We know it well, from bottom to top.
When I hear you talk, it seems almost to me like you're managing a private company, but you're public. How do you do that? You know, they hear a lot of talk about Wall Street putting short-term earnings pressure on companies, but yet you continue to spend on renovations in the teeth of the Texas recession and all those kind of things. How can you get away with it?
Well, look, it's very simple. All you have to look around you at American industry and see what's happened to the people that have had short-term prospectuses. I mean, you can't run a company short-term. And if you let Wall Street run your business, you're not going to be in business too long, I don't think.
What are the lessons we can learn from La Quinta's strategy? Well, La Quinta is our first opportunity to look at a focuser. And there are some important principles in the La Quinta story for competing with a focus strategy. La Quinta also will allow us to broaden our understanding of what it takes to be successful in competing on cost. Now, La Quinta illustrates that a focus strategy starts with the bedrock of choosing a particular target segment, whether it be a particular target customer, a particular item in the product line, a particular geographic region. But this target segment has to have unusual or distinctive needs. If they're not unusual, the focuser won't gain any advantage over the broadly targeted competitor, who will serve the segment perfectly well as part of their broader strategy. Now, a focuser dedicates everything they do to serving the target segment exclusively and not worrying about anybody else. We see in La Quinta's strategy how every step of their product and service offering related to that traveling salesperson, and how that tied together everything La Quinta did. La Quinta case also shows that any focuser is always under constant, relentless pressure to broaden or fuzz their strategy. There's always a temptation to add an extra service or add an extra product in order to get a few more customers. But this temptation simply must be resisted, because if a company starts to fuzz the edge of its focus strategy, it will lose the essential competitive advantage on which it's based, which is this dedication, this consistency of everything they do to that particular target. Now, what can we learn from La Quinta about competing on cost? Well, we learned that a cost-focused strategy depends on finding a target segment that has somewhat lower needs for services or features than most of the market. In La Quinta's case, their customer didn't want a lot of services and features that most motels offered. And La Quinta was able to be low cost simply by finding this customer with that lower level of need. La Quinta shows how cost advantage requires investment. La Quinta spent aggressively on management information systems to reduce the bookkeeping requirements in the locations. They used all concrete construction, which lowered the maintenance costs, but it was expensive. They also aggressively renovated their properties to keep the level of the quality of the product up. A final very important lesson from La Quinta's strategy is how cost leadership requires that costs become really part of the culture of the company. It becomes something that everybody in the company is worrying about every day. And we certainly saw this at La Quinta. Now, we've seen two companies competing with cost-based strategies, one with a broad target and the other choosing the strategy of cost focus. To get some additional perspective on competing on cost, let's go to Emerson Electric Company and talk to Chuck Knight, Emerson's CEO. Emerson is probably the company in the United States that's most identified with being a successful low-cost competitor. Chuck, Emerson uses the term best cost producer to describe its approach to a cost leadership strategy. What steps does Emerson take to be the best cost producer?
Mike, that's I guess a long story, because it evolved out of first being the low-cost producer, which was kind of a theme we had across the corporation in the 70s. But as we started to get into the whole concepts of world-class manufacturing, we knew just being the lowest cost producer wasn't the answer, and so we moved to a definition of best cost producer, which involved 6 key points for us that we used as communication techniques across the corporation to define what we were trying to do. And the first was quality. We couldn't be the best cost producer without having the best quality. They were synonymous. And secondly was to know the competitor's cost. People just really can't know where they are if they don't take the time and energy to find out what their competition's costs are. Third was the need to have a receptivity to change and the willingness to go after productivity in your plants, and the responsibility of management to set that tone and environment. Fourth is a formalized cost reduction program, which is part of the planning process. And too many times companies do their cost reduction when times get tough, and not on a continuous basis as a part of a desire to maintain or achieve a certain level of profitability. So formalized cost reductions. Strong communications related to those cost reductions, because we like to think as a part of our best cost producer plan that all of our employees are part of it. They feel ownership, and the enemy isn't management, it's truly the competition. So that's 5, and the 6 is the commitment of capital to make it happen.
Why is quality so important?
Well,
to being low cost, because it's sort of a paradox.
Yeah, it's, well, when we were in the low-cost producer strategy, everybody used to say, all you guys do is cheapen your product. You know, you'll take material out, or you'll do this, you'll do that. And really, the thing we're selling is the ultimate function and what our product does. And we found, and I've got to say, we learned this from our competition in the 70s and the early 80s, that they have the highest quality, ultimately, all the way through the loop. I'm talking not just quality in the plant, but quality in all the systems and the customer support and everything that goes on in the company to measure all that cost of quality across the board, that if you had the best quality, you also had the lowest cost.
So that quality and cost aren't inconsistent. In fact, they're kind of complementary in many ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You mentioned knowing your competitors' cost. Most companies don't tell you their cost. How do you go about at Emerson really understanding your competitors' cost?
We show every one of our competitors' products to our people and where they're better than we are, or what we're trying to do to make sure we have an edge, and what the individual employee's involvement is in that process. And that's really the exciting part of it, because once you really understand your competitor's product and its cost, you can then communicate more clearly to your employees why we have to do certain things. The people start to understand when they can touch and feel and really see what the battle is all about.
If it's the competitors' costs that are forcing us to do this, not our crazy, dumb management who's trying to beat us up, that changes the tone, doesn't it?
It really does. And not, people like to win. I mean, it's inherent in all of us. We want to win. And so once they see what the target is and who the enemy is, it's a lot easier to focus all those resources and energies, and a lot of fun, too.
Yeah, it sure is. One of the things you mentioned, Chuck, was Emerson's formalized cost reduction program. Could you describe that?
Yeah, it's kind of nuts and bolts, but it might be of interest to you.
It's very much so.
We've been doing this a long time, and what happens is, in our planning conferences, we will, through the process of trying to understand the business, the competition, and the rest of it, get at a level of profitability that we are going to target. And out of that evolves a cost reduction target. And this goes on in 50, 60 different companies. And that particular company will, and every year this goes on as we go through our financial reviews, we set in motion how much cost reduction do we have to get. And in each plant is a man who has or a woman who has a responsibility for cost reduction. And then a quarterly system of follow-up. Monthly in the divisions, but at corporate, we quarterly review the cost reduction progress, and are we on target or aren't we on target, and where are we missing and where are we not making it. And of course, that includes productivity as well as any other kind of cost reduction. And that's tied directly back to our capital spending, of course.
Sure. I think I recall seeing a list of cost reduction projects in a division or plant. Tell me about some of the projects. Give us a feeling for
I
this.
guess there's probably not one project that if we, or maybe 10 or 50, if we didn't do them, it wouldn't matter. I mean, that's the beauty of it. And I like to say that you could go into any Emerson plant, and walk up to one of the people on the machine and ask them what cost reduction they're working on, and they'll describe it to you.
And how many projects would a typical plant have?
Oh, hundreds.
Hundreds. Now, this notion of being a best cost producer is something that I think if I turn to just any random Emerson annual report, I'll find it written in here. Not only will I find it, but I'll find the steps laid out. So what you're doing is not a secret to your competition. Why can't they match you and one-up you?
Because of the subtle points you made earlier. This is not something that you put in a box and bring out when you need it. It's a part of a management process that is tied back to what we're trying to accomplish as an objective for the company. We've had, I think, half of Fortune's 100 come down and talk to us over, let's say, the last 5 years about cost reduction. But if your management process isn't set up in all the subtle ways to incorporate that and make it work, it won't work for you.
I think my discussion with Chuck Knight is a very fitting way to conclude our discussion of cost strategies. It illustrates, again, a number of vital points about this route to competitive advantage. First, cost leadership starts with a good product. There's nothing cheap or inadequate about a low-cost producer's product or service. It's good, but a cost leader is willing to make some choices in order to be low cost, to give away some frills and features. We've also seen over and over how successful cost leaders draw their cost advantage from many sources throughout the business, wherever they can find it. It's not just in manufacturing. It's not just in design. As Chuck Knight has particularly emphasized, successful cost leaders pay intense and regular attention to their competitors' cost positions. They do the homework, the hard work necessary to understand their competitors' cost and use that as a focal point for understanding where they stand. All cost is relative, and competitors are a wonderful motivating device to drive an organization towards ever lower cost. We've also seen, and Chuck has emphasized, how successful cost leaders have cost literally built into the culture of their organization. Everybody is worrying about cost basically all the time. Now, many companies have the misconception that they can successfully compete on cost by having kind of episodes of cost reduction. Everybody worries about cost for 3 months, chops out some people, and breathes a sigh of relief. The Emerson case, as well as the others we've looked at, shows how cost leaders constantly manage costs down. They constantly have a program to drive costs further and further. This is what it takes to be a successful cost leader. Many managers have a misconception about cost strategies. Somehow they view cost strategies as cheap or low wage or somehow dishonorable. I've gotten the sense in many companies that real managers don't compete on costs. That's somehow a sign of failure. I hope those misconceptions have been vividly overcome by what you've just seen. Cost is one important and viable route to competitive advantage, and many of you probably ought to choose it. We've explored the imperatives of cost strategies. Now let's turn to the strategy of differentiation. What are the fundamental principles of competing with a differentiation strategy? How is the philosophy of a differentiator different from a cost-based competitor? Well, a differentiation strategy starts by identifying a number of needs that the buyer thinks are very valuable or very important. And the differentiator sets out to achieve unique performance in meeting these particular needs. This often requires spending a little bit of extra cost. It's hard to provide superior service or better quality without paying a little extra to do that against capable competitors. Now, the point of the exercise is that the differentiator is trying to command premium prices. And these premium prices will translate into superior performance provided the differentiator's costs are in the ballpark. Now, remember that equation I talked about earlier, that strategic equation between relative price and relative cost. The differentiator is striking a very different balance than the cost leader. The differentiator is seeking to command the premium price and is willing to spend a little bit extra to get that if necessary. But the balance is that the premium must be greater than any extra cost of being unique. This requires that the differentiator worry a lot about cost. Anywhere the buyer isn't willing to pay for it, the differentiator seeks to cut costs to the bone. And the differentiator only wants to spend as much as necessary to command the premium. Now, another essential element of a differentiation strategy is to communicate the differentiation to the customer. Often customers can't tell how you're differentiated, and therefore successful differentiators also find ways to make sure the customer knows that they're getting the benefits. Now let's look at two companies that are successfully using differentiation strategies to develop our understanding of this way of competing further. The airline industry has become a symbol of rough and tumble competition. One airline that stands out in weathering this storm is American. Some voice concerns about whether American would be a survivor after deregulation. American has not only survived, but prospered. Now, how has American achieved this superior performance? Well, since deregulation, there's been a tremendous increase in rivalry in the airline industry. Most airlines, both old and new, have been preoccupied with one thing: cost. But American decided on another course. It set out to be the differentiated airline, to provide superior value to its customers. American had to reduce costs to respond to the new environment, but it did so in an imaginative way which did not undermine its ability to differentiate. American aggressively expanded its route system nationally and internationally, including many new pleasure destinations. Growth was vital to its approach to cost control. By the mid-1980s, American had firmly staked out the position as the broad differentiator of the U.S. airline industry. A positioning concept is one thing, but how do you translate it into a strategy? There are literally hundreds of things that an airline could try to do to differentiate, and it's impossible to differentiate on everything. American has chosen to concentrate on a few areas where it wants to be truly unique. The first is onboard service. American believes that this is the single biggest factor in customer satisfaction and works to consistently provide the warmest, most professional service of any airline. Another vital area is on-time departures and arrivals. American recognizes that this is one of the most important things to any passengers. Do you get there in time? American has the #1 record in this regard in Department of Transportation surveys. Another important area is overbooking, a chronic problem in the airline industry today. Passengers get bumped every day, and nothing is more disruptive to a traveler's schedule than being bumped. I can tell you from personal experience. Thanks to state-of-the-art technology, however, American Airlines has fewer passengers involuntarily denied seats than any other airline. But American has another customer, the travel agent. The travel agent is the crucial marketing arm for American Airlines and the airline industry. In fact, travel agents account for about 80% of Americans' total revenues in every year. Now, sometimes companies have a tendency to look at their distribution channel as a necessary evil, somebody they've got to deal with. But effective differentiators don't see it this way. They differentiate with their channel just as much as they try to differentiate with that ultimate customer. The principal tool American uses to differentiate itself with a travel agent is the so-called SABRE system. That's that little box here. This box is an American Airlines computer terminal, and it's sitting here inside Crimson Travel. SABRE allows the travel agent to automate the process of making reservations and issuing tickets. By moving early to provide this service, American not only gained a preferred relationship with its distribution channels, but it created a profitable business in its own right. Creating a superior product or service is only the first part, although a big one, of a differentiation strategy. A successful differentiator must also communicate its superiority to its potential customers. This communication must be clear and it must be credible, it must be believable. American seeks to communicate its differentiation strategy in a number of ways. The first is advertising. Like all airlines, American is a major advertiser on television and newspapers. An essential part of communicating differentiation is paying particular attention to repeat customers. In May of 1981, American pioneered frequent traveler programs in the airline industry. American's program was named Advantage.
Since we felt we had a greater franchise with a very frequent traveler than most of our competitors, we felt a rewards program such as Advantage would be the ultimate lock. Now, naturally, awarding free travel is something that is very fundable by an airline or any airline, and that you typically run 60 to 65% full. Wonderful win-win environment for both American and the frequent traveler.
After creating and communicating superior value, the final part of the differentiation equation is pricing. Differentiation must be reflected in either higher prices or growing market share in order to translate into superior performance. American's been in an environment over the last 6 or 7 years that has been marked by some of the most vigorous, shall we say, price warfare of any industry I've ever worked in or worked around. And yet Americans trying to be the differentiator. I think it's very interesting to understand how American has tried to cope with this unusual problem. Could we start by talking a little bit about why American introduced the super saver concept of pricing?
Sure, Mike. We first came up with the concept of the super saver fare to really satisfy, well, several needs. One was a need to share in a larger percentage of the growing discretionary travel market. We also realized, though, that we were running fairly healthy load factors, maybe 60% in those days, with higher paying passengers, and we didn't want to have all that business walk away from us through an across-the-board price cut. So with the application of some technology, the first steps into a yield management environment, which many people have talked about is something that's newly and very exotic in this business, we really placed through putting some constraints around the applicability of the fare itself, as well as how much inventory we made available for that fare. We allowed ourselves to draw in a hunk of the low fare market, but preserve the high end of the market as well, thereby increasing the revenue contribution from each trip.
The super saver fare is an imaginative way to counter price competitors while preserving the fruits of differentiation. American also employs sophisticated computer technology to capture the greatest amount of revenue from its differentiated position.
What we attempt to do is to generate an overall plane load maximization of revenues by allocating different numbers of seats to the different fare classifications being offered. In essence, we'll sell so many at the very cheap rate, but also realizing that there are a significant number of people, because we are a good airline, who will put pressure on our seats at the last minute and pay a higher price for the scheduled convenience.
To turn its strategy into reality, American performs a number of other vital activities. The first is measurement. It's very hard to achieve superior service unless you measure carefully how well you're doing. Most good differentiators set explicit standards for performance and track progress against them on a continuous basis. American's no exception. It has standards for literally everything, from how long baggage is supposed to take to get to you to the length of your wait in line. Since 1984, American has conducted a continuous in-flight survey which tracks 21 areas of service quality. It has 280 so-called quality shoppers who continuously monitor service quality throughout the American system. Another essential part of implementing American's differentiation strategy is recruiting and training. To make superior service a reality, the rubber meets the road through Americans' people. They need the right skills and, even more importantly, the right attitudes. The second key to making differentiation a reality at American Airlines is the relationship it has established with its employees. American has sought to build a relationship of mutual respect and trust. When other airlines were implementing draconian wage cuts, American pioneered the two-tiered wage system that allowed it to reduce its labor costs through growth. New employees were paid at a lower scale, reflecting current market conditions. As American expanded employment, its average wage costs went down. But there remains one final crucial tool for implementing American's differentiation strategy that we have not yet addressed, and that area is technology. Perhaps the best single example is the Sabre system that I discussed earlier. Sabre is the largest civilian real-time data processing network in the United States, maybe even the world. It involves a cumulative investment of over $400 million. American has poured money into the Sabre technology in order to allow a lot of this fancy reservations, this relationship with the travel agent, and many of the other things I discussed. And this sort of thing permeates the American organization. Little pieces of technology all through the business, like an automated baggage handling system and others, that allow American to achieve this superior performance all through the business. Let's go back to this basic choice of American to try to set itself apart on quality of service. And I like to use the word differentiation because it connotes a broader package of things to set the company apart. Why haven't competitors been able to emulate American?
Well, I think it's important, Mike, to keep in mind that competitors regularly do seek to emulate American. I think the issue, more than perhaps it's long-term coherence is the best way to characterize it. We've had a corporate commitment to move in that direction for a long time. That is a commitment that is shared at many levels of management, is widely understood. As a consequence, I think we are much more consistent at applying it.
Yeah, it's striking how often the truly successful company at carrying out a strategy is one that's really been doing it for a rather long time.
Well, I think the issue here, as much as anything else, because it's a service business and because it is so people dependent, certainly the one thing that I think everybody in the industry would agree we have done with great consistency is communicate effectively and broadly with our people. We've told them what the plan is. We've explained how we're doing against the plan. We've explained the problems and the new approaches.
How much of your own time have you spent doing that?
Well, at least a third of my time is spent in things that I would characterize as primarily communication exercises.
After deregulation, the whole cost level in the airline industry has been kind of rocketing downward. What's America done to deal with the problem of cost?
We've done a whole variety of things. I suppose the first thing we did is we took a very serious look at the manufacturing plant, in our case the fleet. And in the mid-'70s to the mid-'80s, we made some very major transformations. We got rid of whole fleets of airplanes. Secondly, we made some very major changes in where we put the fleet. That is the route structure, whereas we used to fly a lot of point-to-point operations. All the carriers during this period of time have moved towards the hub-and-spoke operation. We moved earlier and more aggressively than most, and as a consequence, that had a very favorable effect on both our unit costs and our unit revenues.
How do you seriously cut costs without undermining quality and differentiation?
And let me say first that I think that the notion of cutting costs in a service business as opposed to a manufacturing business without having any effect on product quality is probably something you cannot do. On the other hand, when you begin to look seriously, you always find costs that are embedded in past practice and in culture that can be made to go away because they don't make any contribution to real quality. And there are hundreds of those things. Some of the onboard service features. I mean, do you need 3 pieces of linen as opposed to 2 pieces of linen? Is there a real reason for that, or is that just something that somebody started 25 years ago and nobody has ever taken a serious look at? We went through a tremendously careful analysis of weight on the airplanes, and we got a lot of weight off, and weight is very expensive. So to some extent, you can, in fact, eliminate cost if you are prepared to say, look, there aren't any books here that are closed. Anything we do that doesn't make a contribution, we want to get rid of. It isn't done overnight. It takes years. You do it repetitively, every year. And sooner or later, you begin to take out some things that the customer does perceive.
You've been urging for some time that the federal government publish actual airline performance statistics. Why?
Now, the problem is that our business is a very unique one in that you can find out the price of any airline ticket anywhere in the world with a single phone call to a travel agent who uses our reservation system. Now, I can't sell you quality unless you've got some qualitative information to compare. In March of last year, I went down and spent a day at the Department of Transportation and took with me a whole series of pro forma advertisements. So these are the kinds of ads that we would run if we had available competitive data about our competitors. Well, finally, we sold that to the Department of Transportation. They are now putting out a very limited data set, but nevertheless some qualitative information.
Now, what are the lessons that we can learn from Americans' differentiation strategy? Well, the first is that any differentiator starts fundamentally with the problem of creating value for their buyer. and value for all the relevant buyers. In the case of American, it was the traveling public as well as the travel agent. The successful differentiator finds areas of buyer value that the buyer readily perceives and views as the most important. American, for example, was very interested in things like on-time performance and on-board service. Those were the areas that they believed were the most visible, top-of-the-mind areas of buyer value. Now, a differentiator doesn't just create value, a differentiator also has to communicate that they're doing it. And that's why American was so anxious to get the government to publish statistics on things like on-time performance and other measures of airline success. That allowed them to credibly tell their story, to communicate their uniqueness. American also illustrates, however, that being differentiated, being unique, is frequently costly. American was willing to spend extra to be unique in those areas that it judged were very valuable for the customer. Now, that doesn't mean that a differentiator spends freely. American was using aggressive investments in technology, for example, to try to minimize the extra cost of providing all that extra service. So a differentiator tries to find ways of differentiating where the extra cost to them is as little as possible, and even better, where the extra cost to them is less than it would be if a competitor tried to emulate them. Now, American also very vividly illustrates the point that differentiators worry a lot about cost. Remember Bob Crandall's discussion of how they strained to get all the weight off the airplane by taking out anything that didn't really contribute to their quality. American revitalized their entire fleet of aircraft to get fuel-efficient planes and to match the fleet better to the route system. But what American's case illustrates is that eventually, in the pursuit of differentiation, you come to a trade-off between cost and differentiation. And American and other successful differentiators are very clear about how they're going to make that trade-off. Now, a final important lesson about differentiators that American shows very vividly is that to sustain your differentiation, you've got to be a moving target. You can't be standing still because your competitors are going to be constantly trying to emulate what you do. Now, American illustrates a broadly targeted differentiation strategy, and we saw how American was getting advantages from that breadth, because the same traveler was a business traveler one day and a vacation traveler the next. Let's look at another company that's differentiating, but is differentiating through a very narrow focus strategy. I'm in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, the home of a company called Cray Research. Cray was founded in 1972 by a mad scientist by the name of Seymour Cray. 4 years later, in 1976, Cray shipped their first computer system. Today, Cray's sales are well on their way to $1 billion per year. Cray's return on equity has averaged a remarkable 25% over the last 5 years, about double the average for the computer industry. Even more interesting is the fact that Cray's performance has been achieved despite the looming presence of such major corporations as IBM and the leading Japanese computer companies. Most interesting to me, however, is that the pundits have been predicting Cray's competitive demise right from the beginning. Yet the competition never seems to come. IBM, Digital Equipment, the major Japanese computer companies all produce very wide lines of computers, spanning from very small to very large machines. But Cray Research does not. Cray Research is dedicated to producing only the world's most powerful computers. In my terminology, it has a focus strategy. It's focusing on supercomputers and seeking to be the differentiated producer of supercomputers in the world.
I think every engineer in the world would like to have a personal Cray, because our business is one where the solution of a problem built in has the creation of another problem. So when the engineer and the scientist solves a problem in 2 dimensions, immediately he becomes dissatisfied with the results. he wants to do it in 3 dimensions. And that creates the need for more computer power. And that's how the supercomputer becomes an addiction to the engineer.
Now, the starting point for Cray's strategy is the technology of the product itself. I'm sitting here next to a Cray XMP computer. You can't feel it, but this machine is hot, and it hums. It's like being next to a volcano. Starting with the initial Cray 1, Cray Research has produced a steady stream of new designs, each of which is a quantum improvement over the one before. In addition to hardware, Cray has developed an extensive advantage in software. It has a proprietary operating system to run the machine. The system is designed so that programmers can use all the commonly accepted programming languages when writing programs. The Cray is also designed to interface or connect readily with any other type of computer equipment. Cray has actively worked with users and with software companies to encourage them to develop programs that will run on the Cray. This growing and growing library of programs both encourages new users and serves as a formidable barrier to entry for new competitors. Selling a Cray is a slow process. It often takes years. After all, customers don't part with $15 million lightly. The front line of Cray's sales approach is a highly trained, highly sophisticated sales force of about 85 people. These people are skilled enough to talk to world-class scientists one day and chief executive officers the next. In addition to the sales force at Cray are 2 other groups. One consists of world-class scientists who dream up new uses for a Cray and show them to customers. Another is benchmarking people who run the customer's own applications on a Cray to prove how effective the machine really is. Both are as important as the sales force in selling such a complicated, expensive product. This is the place where all Crays are built. A Cray takes about 9 months to build from start to finish, including the testing, about the same amount of time as it takes to make a baby. Each Cray involves about 70 miles of wiring and about 170,000 individual connections. Each Cray is built entirely by hand by these ladies that you see here, and they build it error-free. Once a Cray passes muster here in Chippewa Falls, the next step is to ship it to the customer. Before that, though, a Cray advance team visits the customer's location before the machine gets there to make sure everything's ready. But that's not where Cray's contact with the customer stops. In fact, that's just the beginning. Because along with every Cray go 2 hardware engineers and 2 software engineers, all Cray personnel. They live permanently with that machine 24 hours a day. They make sure it's running, and they make sure the customer knows how to use it effectively. Along with the machine also goes a complement of spare parts. Those parts, right on site, allow most problems to be dealt with on the spot. This combination of design, of manufacturing quality, and of permanent on-site personnel and parts means that the Cray has remarkable reliability. Crays have an uptime of 99%. That means they're running 99% of the time. This level of reliability is unprecedented for a large-scale computer. This performance is reflected in Cray's pricing strategy. Cray prices on the basis of value, not the cost of producing the machine. While the Cray is the world's most expensive computer, it can save its customers literally tens of millions of dollars. It creates so much value for the customer that it's really a bargain. Industries as diverse as aerospace, automobiles, and oil have saved literally tens of millions of dollars using a Cray. I've described some of the most important elements of Cray's strategy. But carrying this strategy out requires the company to perform a number of other important steps. The first one is R&D spending. Cray spends 15% of its revenues on research and development every year. This year, that's over $100 million, and all of that is on supercomputers. This 15% of revenue comes right off the top. There's no question at Cray about priorities. The level of technological performance and imagination required at Cray demands superb people. To find them, Cray goes through a very careful and exhaustive process of recruiting. People interview very widely in the organization. For example, a designer would be interviewed by salespeople, by service people, by management, not just by other designers. Cray's looking for people who can work very well across functional lines. The organization structure is very flat and fluid, not a hierarchy. A way of summarizing Cray's relationship with employees, in my view, is this little book. This book has pictures of a Cray machine all the way through the manufacturing process. It's got pictures of the employees that actually worked on the machine, and their signatures are here inside. This book goes with the machine to the customer and stays with that machine for its entire life. What a symbol of quality and of trust in a product. There's a final aspect of the Cray strategy that in many ways cuts across many of the other things I've talked about. That's a unique relationship that Cray has with its customers.
A customer comes to Chippewa Falls. Their engineers talk to our engineers. Their CEO talks to our CEO. People from the factory go to the field. And it's this constant dialogue that makes it into a long-term relationship. We have no secrets from our customers. When they ask us about where we are on such and such product development, we tell them exactly where we are. When they tell us what our plans, when they ask what our plans are for the future, we disclose the plans openly. Because unless they know where we are going and we know where they want to go, it's impossible to have this relationship. And it seems to work.
So at Cray, the customer is allowed to go behind the scenes in the back room, if you will.
They're encouraged to do that. Many of our customers call the engineers directly. And we have removed all the impediments, if you will, between the customer and the engineer. In fact, we facilitate that process.
The customer relationship also means that the customer sells for Cray. When you're buying a $15 million computer, you're going to want to know what other people think. The referrals that Cray gets from its own customers are some of the most essential elements of its marketing strategy. So far, I've described the essential elements of Cray's strategy. But what about the competition? IBM has by and large ignored the supercomputer market, choosing to focus also on mainstream data processing. It does have a souped-up version of its Sierra line of computers, but these fall far short of Cray in performance. Japanese companies have entered the supercomputer industry as well. NEC is the most serious entrant, but so far the Japanese have only sold one supercomputer in the United States, and some would say they didn't sell it. They gave it away. In contrast, Cray has 10 installations in Japan and hopes for many more. A final interesting development in the supercomputer world is the emergence of so-called mini supercomputers. These are machines that are smaller than a full supercomputer, but bigger than most conventional machines, and they're priced accordingly. The mini supercomputer market filled an important need, an important gap in the marketplace, and has grown to be a very large segment. It's estimated to be as much as $1 billion by 1990. However, Cray has chosen not to enter this new segment and remains exclusively focused on supercomputers. It estimates today that the market for supercomputers has gone from the 90 customers they thought in 1976 to over 1,000 customers today. John, could we start with, in some sense, the most basic question about Cray? There's a vast computer industry out there with lots of different products and services. Why has Cray chosen to focus on this one narrow objective, as you say, the most powerful computer systems available?
There are two reasons. One of them is historical, the other one is strategic. The historical reason is very simple. The company was organized by a fellow named Seymour Cray, who for the last probably 3 decades has been the dominant individual figure in designing these high-powered computers. The strategic reason is just as important, I think, because it gives us the ability to really stay focused in what we do. We've decided time and again over the years that Cray's been in business now to continue our specialization in just this one field.
There has been one new entrant in a sense that has been a big success, and that is these so-called mini supercomputers. Right. Now the question I have is, why hasn't Cray entered that business?
That's right to the point, because we looked very carefully at that business before there was such a business. I mean, we could see, too, this gap developing in the marketplace between us and the VACs, let's say. And there were several people at the company that really felt we ought to jump into that. And particularly in our marketing organization, of course, it's always better to have a broader range of products. And even our customers, for the big machines, were saying to us, you know, really, you guys ought to make a smaller version of what you make. We could use it as sort of a front-end computer for the main Cray computer. And we looked very closely. In fact, we put up a whole business plan. We called the product, internally at least, the quarter horse. I can't remember what year this is now, but it's at least 4 years ago, maybe even 5. Well before there was a super or mini supercomputer company or market. We fleshed out the business plan, came up with a design, figured out how we could re-engineer our current product in different circuit technology to reduce the cost yet maintain good performance. We were essentially ready to go. We had all the blanks filled in. In the final analysis, when we took a look at it, we said, no, we're not going to do it. Because if we do it, there's a terrible risk that we divert our efforts, that we lose our focus, that we don't stay as committed to the top of the line as we currently are. It takes all our attention, all of our attention and our resources just to keep moving ahead with the supercomputers, with this technology. So we said no.
It gets at really the heart of the whole strategy, doesn't it? Because it's always easy to make the incremental add that seems very closely related, but eventually you wake up and you find out that you've lost the essence of your strategy.
Exactly.
And I think that this is a symbol of that issue. You've mentioned several times the organization at Cray and the control issues. How do you keep the organization onto this narrow target?
Well, at least we spend a lot of time talking about it. I go around and talk about it. Other people go around and talk about it. People talk about it among themselves. I stand up in front of our people and say it all the time. Look, we go through this whole story and we say we're going to be very specific in what we do, and that allows us to be very general in our actual day-to-day work because we're so focused on this. But I say there are two major risks in this kind of a business strategy. Number one, and they grow out of perhaps the same thing, we define it in the mission statement as the most powerful computer system available in the world. That's a singular. There's only one number one. So the first risk is if we don't make the most powerful computer in the world, we got serious problems here. Number two, even if we do make the most powerful computer in the world and nobody wants to buy the most powerful computer in the world, we got another problem because we all like to eat, and it's the customers obviously that pay the bills, and so we're out of business.
Yeah.
Those are risks we take. They're out in front. They're not rational. I mean, you can easily come up with a case that says you should diversify and branch out into things and hedge your bets and cover economic ups and downs, make sure if you're competitively get behind in one area, you got another area where you're ahead. That's the rational thing to do, and we reject that because we're going to take these two irrational risks. But by taking the two irrational risks, ironically enough, I think we maximize, in fact, I know we maximize the odds, number one, of our making the most powerful computer in the world because we don't have a backup plan, we have no alternative, we like it here, therefore let's do this. And number two, by God, we're going to find somebody to buy them.
Now, what can we learn from the Cray case about a differentiation strategy? Well, Cray once again illustrates how differentiation starts with creating value for the customer that justifies a premium price. We see in the Cray case how that premium price is very visible and very substantial, but how it's cheap compared to the unique benefits that the Cray provides. Cray also illustrates how an effective differentiation strategy involves more than just the physical product. This is a common error that many companies make. They concentrate their differentiation too much on just the product. In Cray's case, they understood that it was the total ability of the customer to use their product that was as important as the product itself. So they have the on-site service personnel and the on-site customer engineers, for example. Cray also, like American, worked hard to communicate its differentiation. It had benchmarking people to actually run test programs for potential buyers. It aggressively used referrals of past customers to credibly communicate how effective the Cray was. Also, Cray was a moving target. It sought to aggressively improve its performance in generational leaps, just like Americans sought to innovate in its business. Now, Cray also allows us to supplement our understanding of what it takes to be a successful focuser. Like La Quinta, Cray built its entire strategy around one target segment, the supercomputer. It optimized everything it did for this particular segment, from the architecture of its computers to the way it sold the product to the way it serviced the product. Everything from soup to nuts was optimized on this particular target segment. And that optimization, that concentration, allowed Cray to outperform its less focused competitors. The differentiation-focused strategy requires that the company isolate a segment that has somewhat greater or more extensive needs than most parts of the market. Cray's customer wanted this very high speed. Think back to La Quinta. There, in a cost-focused strategy, you're looking for a customer that has somewhat less needs, and you can economize in the process of serving those lower needs. Here it was the opposite. Now, my conversation with John Rollwagon illustrates not only the benefits of a focus strategy, but also the risks. A focuser is betting everything on one particular target segment. If that segment goes away or doesn't grow rapidly, or if the focuser is unable to achieve success in that segment, well, they're in serious trouble. But yet it's the bet that's the essence of their ability to gain advantage. And it's the bet that Cray was willing to make. Cray also shows, like La Quinta, how any focuser is facing constant pressure to broaden or fuzz their strategy. Remember that interesting story about Cray's temptation to get into super minis. If this temptation is succumbed to, the focuser undermines the very essence of their advantage. And so far, anyway, Cray has kept their focus and their advantage very robust. Now, let's step back from this entire discussion of positioning to come to some perhaps broader lessons about positioning in any industry, no matter what strategy you're trying to follow. I think the first broad lesson is that successful strategy, whichever the route to competitive advantage, must worry about both a company's own position as well as industry structure. Remember how American took some vigorous action to improve the whole industry. In the pursuit of one's own position, one can't forget industry analysis. Second, all the successful companies we've seen have picked strategies that are different from their competitors. Now, there's a great tendency in strategy to imitate. You think you're reducing your risk by replicating or imitating what your rivals are doing. But these companies show how competitive advantage demands that a company set itself apart. Pick a different strategy, a different route to competitive advantage than its competitors have followed. We also see from these cases how essential to any strategy is making choices. Making choices about exactly what the company is going to be. And this requires trade-offs, and this requires taking risk, and this requires deliberately avoiding things that you could choose to do. But it's the trade-offs, it's the risk that is the flip side and the essential flip side of advantage. Now, as you've been watching, hopefully your route to competitive advantage in your organization or ones that you're interested in is clear. You can identify what basic strategy you're following. And what you've seen will allow you to enhance that strategy and make it even clearer. But if you've got that sneaking suspicion that your company might be stuck in the middle, well, it's time for a new look at strategy in your organization. I've talked about a lot of ideas so far about how to develop strategy, and I've shown you a number of industries and companies that hopefully bring these ideas to life. In this final part of the program, though, I want to do something different. I want to try to show you how to bring all these ideas together and apply them in your own organization in practice. Now, in my view, the best way to do this is to actually put ourselves in the strategist's chair of a company that has to make a major strategic change. By trying to use the ideas to analyze a company's problem, we'll get some experience and practice in putting it all together. The company I've chosen for this purpose is the Skill Corporation. Skill is a manufacturer of portable power tools like circular saws. Some of you may be familiar with the company. Skill has a long and proud history in the power tool industry, but had fallen on hard times by the late 1970s. It had a wide product line and a fully global market position, but it was facing intense challenges. It was faced with the difficulty of competing with Black & Decker Corporation, an aggressive competitor that was much larger. Skill was also having to deal with new and severe challenges from a Japanese company, Makita, as well as a number of European competitors that had never been active in the United States before. Skill's financial results were deteriorating, and it was clear that they were not in a viable long-term position. Now, Emerson Electric acquired Skill Corporation in 1979. Emerson knew they were in a turnaround situation, but what to do was far from clear. Included in this video package is a case study which describes the complete strategic position and situation facing Skill. I urge you to read this case and think about what you would do given everything you've seen. Now, as you're thinking about Skill, let's look in on one of my Harvard Business School classes discussing this very problem. As you'll see, my Harvard MBAs don't have anywhere near all the answers. The solution to this problem is far from obvious. Okay, so Black & Decker has lower prices, but a better image. And you said Skill has all these models. Why isn't that good? Why isn't having a lot of models?
Well, because in this industry, economies of scale are very important. And when you have all these different models, you can never get to that point.
You know, how else can we characterize the situation? Wick?
I think that Skill is traditionally been an engineering and a product-driven company.
Okay.
The one strength that you really see that they have is they've always been an innovator, and they really pride themselves on aggressively introducing new models to the point where they'll bring out a new tool or a new product line and not worry about commonality of motors, commonalities of production processes, and that they're not a cost-oriented company, and I don't think they're a marketing-driven company to any extent at all.
Okay, so we've said that Skill is got good products, they've been an innovator, but they've got a hell of a lot of them, and they can't seem to make them very efficiently. They haven't worried about that in the past. What other issues are facing us as Skill in this industry? Rosalie?
They really have no brand name, and they don't advertise to try to build it.
Okay, so Black & Decker's spending millions and millions of dollars a year on advertising, and so is Rockwell and the others, but Skill doesn't. They've been relying on the little guy in the hardware store to sell for them, or the distributor, the contractor supply outlet, where there's an expert assister making the purchase decision. And if they want to compete in this volume business, they got to do something about their brand, don't they?
They have to build brand image, or they have to find a niche through the hardware store or the home centers.
Okay, so that's a critical choice, kind of mass merchandiser, build that advertising image versus stay in the traditional channel and rely on the push. Okay, so Francois, based on everything you've heard, what would you do as Skill?
Yeah, basically what I would do first, I would address the cost issue by trimming the product line.
Okay.
So the second thing I would do from that is building on this image of Skill. And basically I would increase the advertising budget. And I would try to build an image and differentiate myself from Black & Decker. Build an image of a consumer tool, but which is issued from the professional line, something better than the Black & Decker.
Okay, so we're going for like an upscale consumer market?
Exactly.
I think Black & Decker, in spite of their cost position that now is better than ours, has a strategic tie to a broad product line that's going to be more difficult to abandon than Skill's broad product line.
Okay, so Black & Decker is kind of committed to the wide line. They're trying to serve consumers and industrial globally.
I think, now going into that, that implies that we're going to pursue the consumer market, but it also presumes that we're going to be able to resolve the channel conflict that we're going to be faced with. Since we've identified that the hardware stores are the main channel right now for Skill saws, and we also know from the case that some of the mass merchandisers and some of the consumer outlets that are selling at high volumes are now selling these power tools at a cost that's even at a price that's even lower than the cost for hardware stores.
Yep.
We're going to have to manage that channel conflict that's going to evolve out of that.
So you're saying there is an inherent channel conflict. The hardware store is not pleased to see the same tool down the street at the mass merchandiser.
Right. Because a hardware store is very dependent on high margins because they have a much smaller volume.
Because they've got all this cost. They have to give you all this help and walk you around and show you where the bolts and the nuts are. So how should Skill resolve that conflict?
It's a difficult issue. I think they might end up losing a lot of their hardware stores because their real strategic advantage is going to be in very low-cost tools.
So you think Skill should really make a push towards the mass merchandiser channel, recognizing that they're going to cost themselves in the hardware channel?
I think that's right.
So we're kind of saying that the high end is crowded. We've got Milwaukee, we've got Japanese competitors, we've got European competitors. No way we're going to be the premium player. And now we're debating whether we really can be the low-end, low-price consumer tool company or not. And we can compete with Black & Decker on cost in the low end without any image. Okay? Pat?
I don't think we have a chance being the low-cost producer. Today we have 7% of the worldwide market. And there's 4 players that are bigger than us.
Yep.
The one opportunity that I see is to very aggressively trim the product line and perhaps specialize in the circular saw business. That's really our strength, and build on that.
Okay. Elliot.
Well, I'm apprehensive about doing that because the total business is $866 million. But if we just focus on circular saws, it's only $143 million. So we're cutting ourselves into a very small business. And I think a key goes back to what you said before about the channel conflict. Because it seems to me that if Skill has a channel conflict where they're selling to home centers and mass merchandisers, and they may not want to sell to the mass merchandisers because the home centers would be upset seeing cheaper products right down the street. Well, it seems to me that Black & Decker very possibly has the same conflict. And I think
they do. So basically what you're saying is, look, let's take advantage of the channel conflict.
Exactly.
Black & Decker can't afford to not sell to mass merchandisers.
Exactly.
But what are our sales to mass merchandisers? Chicken feed.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Classic push strategy. We're smaller than they are, but we're more profitable on a percentage basis, which means if you've got a channel that's willing to push a product because it's more profitable, those are the people we're going to tie in with. And Black & Decker has to have the Kmarts, they have to have all the mass merchandisers because they have a massive advertising budget that they have to spread across a number of units.
Okay.
A large base of unit sales. They've got to keep that market.
Okay. So instead of having to advertise, we'll take the push.
Right, and we'll let them have the pull.
Now we'll see what Skill did in a minute. Now you've thought about what you would do as Emerson Management, and you've heard my class discuss the issues. Let's go down to Heber Springs, Arkansas, and actually see Skill's new strategy for the power tool business. To see what Skill did, I'm going to take you into this plan in just a minute. But the real starting point for the Skill strategy was in the distribution channels. The starting point for Skill's new strategy was a decision to significantly reduce the number of distribution channels it sought to serve. Skill decided to emphasize hardware stores, home centers, and such channels as contractor supply and lumber supply houses. Skill decided to de-emphasize such channels as electrical supply stores, plumbing supply houses, and a number of other specialized outlets. But most significantly, Skill chose not to sell to mass merchandisers, the Kmarts and the Caldors of this world, despite the fact that these channels represented a substantial fraction of industry volume. Why did Skill choose to do this? Well, the first reason was that it allowed them to streamline their product line and their sales force, something I'll talk more about later. The second reason, though, went to the heart of Skill's approach to marketing. By keeping its product out of the mass merchandisers, Skill sought to enlist the support of the hardware stores and the home centers in its marketing program. Now, Black & Decker, Skill's major competitor, sold to all the channels. Now, you can imagine that a hardware store or a home center that provides a lot of service and advice with the product was not at all happy to see a Black & Decker tool down the street at the mass merchandiser sold at a discount. Now, to understand how successful it's been, let's look at the display in this store. I've just been down an entire row of power tools, and where is the Skill display? Well, it's right here on the end of the aisle in the prime position, right where you come in the store. Here's support of your channels personified. I'm back at the Heber Springs plant, and this is the engineering department. It's been a very busy place lately. By narrowing the range of channels it sought to serve, Skill was able to substantially reduce the number of products in its line. In fact, it cut its line by almost 50%. In the process, it immediately lost 20% of its revenue. But Skill